I now want to spend a little bit of time talking about Dena'ina or Dena'ina Storytelling. We have some excellent resources of elders' stories that have been preserved in print and also in video and through various sources, as well as elders who still share their knowledge and their stories with us. Some books that you might check out that I would recommend include by Joan Tannenbaum, Dena'ina Storytelling, Traditional Stories of the Dena'ina Athabascans, Shempits, Alaska, The Territory of the Upper Cook Inlet Dena'ina, edited by Carrie and Fall, as well as A Dena'ina Legacy, The Collected Writings of Peter Kalfornsky, which you've been reading out of. And I want us to think a little bit about stories and the role they played traditionally in Dena'ina society, as I've talked about before. The winter time was a time of telling stories. The summers were far too busy, it seems, whereas the winter was a time to tell stories, and people would oftentimes spend those cold winter evenings telling stories, and storytelling was sort of a mark of pride. If somebody had stories that they could tell, a different story every night during the winter, that was like really impressive, and people liked to be able to share different stories with each other. It was also a form of instruction, telling stories to teach people. So many of these sukto have lessons to them, some of them subtle, some of them very overt. And then storytelling was also just a form of entertainment. So we'll see a little bit of all of that in a moment when we look at some actual storytellings. But one of the things I want to point out is that storytelling does a lot of things in societies. One of the things that it does, and again I would recommend here to you Keith Basso's Wisdom Sits in Places, it makes place meaningful. It helps us turn our space, our physical surroundings, into something that's emotionally and symbolically meaningful to us by telling stories of what happened here. In the process, stories often paint a picture of the past, and by telling them, we're often embodying a sacred past. We oftentimes are sharing words that in a specific culture may be even considered holy or sacred, or at least very special. It also brings the past into the present so we can make it relevant, right? By talking about old stories, we can then apply them to new situations and gain insight from them. And oftentimes storytelling reinforces the values and the norms of a society. It's used to correct people, to tell people how to live right, and it often instills a sense of identity into people. So we will talk about some of those themes by switching now screens over into here, and we will talk about some Dena'ina stories that we read. The first one was Paulie Creek's story, and in that story, Peter Kalfornsky, it's a bit of an origin story. It's right at the beginning of the book, and he kind of tells a story of where he learned many of his stories. And in one of them, he's talking about that he was working in Paulie Creek, and that they were doing work digging up clams for $1.25 for a box full of clams. He was working with his uncle, his maternal uncle. Again, this follows that pattern of going and staying with one's maternal uncle, one's mother's brother, if one is a young man, to learn the ways. But while he was doing this, it says, I would fire up the steam bath for the old men, and they would all take a steam bath. So this is like basically you would enter a room and like have a ton of steam from hot rocks and water, and I put rocks on the fire for other people. When evening came, the old men would gather and tell stories. Come, they said to me, and I would listen to them. Before the year 1921, I heard those songs and stories there. So he's suggesting, right, that he had heard many of these stories that he shares in his book from that time period when he was learning from elders, as indeed stories have been passed down for many generations. One of the things I had in that reading was this about Niña Suktu, or animal stories. It says that these were stories from the time when animals could talk. So Peter Kalfornsky sometimes would distinguish between the time when animals could talk and then the coming of the campfire people. So the idea of sort of a time period where humans and animals often blended into each other, could speak to each other, could communicate to each other. And then there were the campfire people, human beings, who could also at first have more communication with animals, but over time lost that. Or at least it's not emphasized as much. And then you have more contemporary historic time stories. But in these animal stories, it talks about that oftentimes animals change to human form and then back again to their animal selves. It calls this as metaphors for coexistence of humans and animals. Although I don't think it would necessarily be correct to say that it's always meant to be metaphorical in the sense of solely metaphorical. This is a fascinating statement right here in the story Imagination. There was a lot of reasons I wanted you to read it, but I love this opening line. The Dena'ina didn't have any books and they didn't read, but they had beliefs of their own. So very often, European settlers saw their own use of written word as a mark of superiority for indigenous peoples who did not have that. Of course, there were indigenous peoples who did have written words, such as the Maya, but for those who did not, oftentimes viewed it as a mark of superiority. So much so, in fact, that Cherokee people developed their own syllabary after the arrival of Europeans as a way of marking Cherokee in a particularly Cherokee way, rather than just having to put it in a Roman script or English letters. But in any ways, Peter Kalfornski comes out swinging here with a strong statement of, just because our stories were oral storytelling doesn't mean that they were not important, meaningful beliefs. And he's telling a story here. Here's that Bagesh that we've talked about before, but he's telling a story and about the bird that found the animals had different names in Dena'ina, so it's all these different names. And then he tells the story of this bird of the northern shrike, which is a beautiful bird, by the way, if you've never seen one. We should be able to pull up a picture here really quick. Beautiful, beautiful bird. Yep. Hey, northern shrike. And as you can see, it has a crossbill. The beak comes over the edge, which they talk about that later in the story, but it talks about people, like the animals being gone, right, which is a huge concern for many reasons, not the least of which is that the people are worried about starving. And they travel and they travel and they travel, and then there's a little old man, and they explain what's happened, and he says, it'll be difficult, but you talk to the one on the other side of the mountain and he will help you. So they went and they met this northern shrike, and then he is able to sing his 4 mountains and then strike the mountain, and the mountain splits open, and he went in with them singing. So we have here a theme that we see in other Athabascan cultures and other native cultures, period, of songs as being potent and powerful in the world, at least here in this specific story. And on one side was the mountain cleft, on the other side the ocean. He was singing the song. All the animals were there, unable to escape. He walked with the people until he got to the center of the country. He stuck his cane on the cliff. So again, this is an animal that has a walking cane, right? So we see there that we're in this time period where animals are oftentimes having human traits. They're talking like humans and moving like humans. They're being persons. They're being beings. And indeed, oftentimes, as we talked about a couple weeks ago with that story with the dogs, it's almost the idea that animals have sort of an animal clothing or outer layer, but then a person side underneath. A powerful statement of the shared personhood or common sentience or a common sense of having beingness, personhood, soulness, with animals. So, powerful story for sure. That song that I was singing in the different names, the Dena'ina call me. So the power of songs, and indeed many of these stories talk about how certain songs were gained. I also found this interesting that he kind of remarks, at first he didn't remember it all either, but we told it to each other part by part, and eventually we got it straightened out. So the nature of oral storytelling is that sometimes very different versions arise as different people tell the story, and also that sometimes people have to come back together and kind of hammer out what the story actually is. It's not always a rote presentation, although sometimes it may be. The story, the animals divided into pairs, I thought that was likewise very interesting. Again, this idea of partnership. and then this idea of where this hunting song came from. It comes from this original story of the dog, and that, the dog will challenge anything, which of course, to suggest that the dog is so brave to go to the campfire people, and eventually, of course, that bravery is helpful because the dog becomes a great hunter. So fascinating stuff, the animals pairing off. What else did I want to say about that? The dog makes a song about going face to face with the other animals, the animals who did not accept him. And then the Raven story I thought was fascinating as well. Obviously, Raven here, as often is the case, Raven is sometimes a trickster figure, as we oftentimes think of him, but sometimes also a creator figure, sometimes a source of wisdom, sometimes a source of great foolishness or silliness. Raven stories can be many different things, which goes against some of the ways that we sometimes think of sacred stories in Western religious traditions, but ravens can very much be more than one thing in these traditions. By the way, I love the Dena'ina term for raven. It's goini, which sounds a whole lot like ravens sound sometimes when they start to do their kind of almost car alarm sounding chirp sound. So I thought that was a very descriptive onomatopoeia kind of name. It's a story where he takes his eye out, and then eventually I found it interesting that the Dena'ina people show up and meet him, and they said, "What happened to you?" And he says, "Sand got in my eye." And they say, "Let's see, maybe it's bad." This is a good example of a story sort of subtly reinforcing proper values. Nobody has to sit down and be like, "Hey, you should help people out if they're hurt." But instead, the very fact that you have the Dena'ina people sort of checking on Raven and like, "Hey, you got sand in your eye? Like, let's check it. Let's see how it's doing. Make sure it's okay," is yet another one of the many reminders in stories of sort of a good way to act. You oftentimes have characters sort of doing default social behavior that would be the correct social behavior. In this case, checking on somebody if they've got something going on with their eye. But then he says this whole thing about the eye being bringing good luck, this kind of elaborate story to cover for the fact, I guess, that he had pulled out his eye so that he could watch for people. It's all quite bizarre and silly, as Raven sometimes is, but he sings a song with it for luck, and then that becomes a song having to do with Raven that is sung for luck or for good success. So another Raven story. It talks also in this reading about lesson stories, lesson stories, whereas in some of these other stories, like Raven stories, there's sort of subtle moral lessons, right? It tells about contemplation of all kinds of things and how wishes sometimes come true. In this story, Raven's careful about what he eats, he's watchful. They make songs, right? There's all these kind of subtle lessons. In these kind of stories, lesson stories, sometimes it just kind of comes out a little more overtly and says it, and sometimes they are very sometimes they are very kind of like profound lessons, if you will, such as the mouse story that we'll read next week, where we learn about the importance of generosity, and that generosity may matter even more than a hard work ethic. And also, there's other stories about people who mistreated dead animals or mistreated living animals, and as a result were hurt or experienced a terrible dream. So you have sometimes these stories that are really like kind of these profound moral messages of central Dena'ina values, and other times it's more for entertainment and kind of meant to be funny, but at the same time is also teaching a lesson, right? As sometimes joking stories do in other cultures as well. So the stupid boy story, right? And him, I'll go check the trap. If there's nothing in the trap, what should I do? So the way a deadfall trap works, a traditional Dena'ina deadfall trap, the animal pulls on the bait and then pulls off the beam that's holding up the trap, and the trap crushes the animal. So this boy, he's asking this like dumb question, right? Like, what if there's nothing in the trap? What if nothing's been trapped? Like, what do you mean if nothing's been trapped, right? Like, that just means you just have to be patient and wait longer. So they're kind of like razzing him, right? Like kind of maybe teasing him, or just like, well, you just go grab that bait. Or maybe sort of playing into his stupidity intentionally. But he grabs the bait, the deadfall falls on him, and he trapped himself. And then the next day his aunt went there and his feet were sticking out. She threw his body over the bank and told him, "Your stupidity killed you." This is most likely not meant to be a story that literally happened. And, there's different ways that stories markers to show what kind of a genre they are. We use once upon a time to say that it's a fairy tale. In a similar vein, there are things here that mark it as a story that's probably not literal. So not the least of which is that she just throws his body over the bank. That would be a very improper way to deal with a dead body, traditionally in Dena'ina culture. So it's clear that this is more meant to be a silly story, an entertainment story, but also one with a lesson, right? He was being stupid. He was asking dumb questions, and then not only that, but he heard a dumb answer and chose to believe it, and then went and got himself killed. So it's sort of a subtle message about that. So that is what I wanted to share with those. And as we can see with all of that, right, there are so many different things that stories do, that storytelling does. So just having a respect for those stories and hearing those stories. I'm also very big into the idea of that it's more powerful to hear a story spoken than to read it on a page. Please understand that as powerful as these stories can be on a page, if they sometimes feel like the full power is not coming across, that's partly because this isn't actually how stories get told traditionally, right? Oral storytelling traditionally is oral storytelling. It's spoken. And when people speak stories, it sounds different than just reading it on a page. You get to hear the different emotion in their voice that tells you more about what the characters are thinking, which is oftentimes left unsaid in oral storytelling, and instead you figure it out from the voice of the storyteller. Things that are meant to be ironic or silly, the storyteller can indicate that with their voice. A lot of that is not obvious on the printed page. So although we're very grateful for these printed pages, we should also recognize that oral storytelling is itself a verbal art form that is very different in person than it is just reading it